My name is Claire Bennett, and if there's one thing I've learned after 3 years of marriage, it's this. Betrayal doesn't always come from strangers. Sometimes, it comes from the person who sleeps beside you every night, the one who holds your child while silently wondering, is this baby really mine? I'm not someone who loses her temper easily. I used to believe I was the kind of woman who knew how to be patient, who put family first, who smiled through careless jokes and judgmental glances. But the day someone made a joke about my daughter's paternity right in front of my husband and he laughed louder than anyone else, I realized something. My silence was no longer a virtue. It had become complicity in my own pain. The story I'm about to tell doesn't begin with a fight. It begins with a laugh, and that laugh changed me into someone I never imagined I'd have to become. The champagne glass felt cold against my palm as I stood in our backyard, watching relatives mill around the white tablecloth we'd spread beneath the oak tree. Emma's baptism had gone beautifully. She'd barely cried when Father Martinez poured the holy water over her tiny head. 6 months old and already perfect in every way that mattered. Will's family filled our Seattle backyard with their usual mix of polite conversation and subtle judgment. His Aunt Linda held court near the dessert table, her voice carrying that particular tone reserved for observations she thought were clever. I was refilling the punch bowl when I heard her laugh, sharp and deliberate. "Emma doesn't look like anyone from Will's side of the family," Linda announced, loud enough for the entire gathering to hear. "Maybe she's a special delivery from UPS." The words hit me like ice water. I froze, ladle suspended over the crystal bowl, and slowly turned toward the sound of laughter. Several relatives chuckled, but what shattered something inside me was Will's response. My husband Emma's father threw back his head and laughed louder than anyone else. "Honey delivers fast," he called out, slapping his knee like it was the funniest thing he'd ever heard. I stood there holding that ladle, watching the man I'd married for 3 years participate in a joke about our daughter's paternity. Emma slept peacefully in her portable crib nearby, oblivious to the fact that her own father was entertaining doubts about whether she belonged to him. The champagne bubbles in my glass had gone flat, just like something essential in my chest. That night, after the relatives had gone home and Will had fallen asleep beside me, I stared at the ceiling and remembered. This wasn't the first time. It was just the first time he'd done it publicly. There had been other moments, seemingly innocent questions that now felt like accusations. "Why does Emma have gray eyes when both of us have brown?" he'd asked when she was 2 months old. "Must be from your side of the family," he'd mused, but his tone suggested he wasn't entirely convinced there was a genetic explanation. 3 weeks after Emma was born, when I was still bleeding and exhausted, Will had casually mentioned how different she looked from his baby pictures. "Are you sure about the timing?" he'd asked one evening, trying to sound casual as he scrolled through his phone. "I'm just asking." Just asking. The phrase that had become his shield whenever he wanted to plant seeds of doubt without taking responsibility for the garden they might grow in. His mother had been more direct. During one of her visits, she'd actually handed me a DNA test kit from Amazon. "These days, you can never be too careful," she'd said with a smile that didn't reach her eyes, just to put everyone's mind at ease. I'd thrown the kit in the trash as soon as she left, but the damage was done. The message was clear. They believed I was capable of deception. They believed Emma might not be Will's daughter. And worse, they believed I was the kind of person who would lie about something so fundamental. 2 days after the baptism, I found myself sitting in the parking lot of a private medical clinic 40 minutes outside Seattle. I'd driven there with a small envelope containing Emma's hair from her brush and strands I'd collected from Will's razor. My hands shook as I filled out the paperwork. Dr. Patricia Chen, the elderly physician who handled paternity testing, looked at me with kind but experienced eyes. "Sometimes the truth can hurt more than uncertainty," she said gently. "Are you prepared for whatever the results might show?" I met her gaze steadily. "I don't need anyone to understand my choice. I just need proof of what I already know." The next 14 days stretched like a slow-motion nightmare. I went through the motions of normal life, feeding Emma, doing laundry, cooking dinner for Will while something inside me counted down the hours. Every time Will made a comment about Emma's features, or asked an innocent-seeming question about her development, I felt the weight of that pending envelope. I caught myself studying Emma's face, looking for traces of Will that others might have missed. Her nose was definitely his, small and slightly upturned. She had his stubborn chin, too, though it was still soft with baby fat, but her coloring was different, more olive-toned like mine, and her hair was darker than either of ours had been as infants. Did it matter? Should a father's love depend on genetic confirmation? The questions tormented me, but I pushed them aside. I hadn't created this situation. I was simply responding to it. The call came on a Tuesday morning while Emma napped, and Will was at work. Of Dr. Chen's voice was gentle but professional. Mrs. Bennett, your results are ready. Would you like to pick them up in person, or shall I mail them? I'll come today, I said, already reaching for my car keys. The envelope felt heavier than paper should. I sat in my car in the clinic parking lot and tore it open with trembling fingers. The language was technical, but the conclusion was unmistakable. 99.99% probability that Will Bennett was the biological father of Emma Grace Bennett. I should have felt vindicated. Instead, I felt something much more complex, a mixture of relief and profound sadness. I was right, but being right meant I'd been forced to prove something that should never have been questioned. I was Emma's mother, and she was Will's daughter, but we'd all been reduced to percentages and genetic markers because trust had been poisoned by doubt. That evening, I found something that made everything worse. While searching for our tax documents, I discovered an email Will had sent to a divorce attorney 6 weeks after Emma was born. The subject line was simple: consultation regarding paternity and asset protection. The body of the email contained a single question. If the child is not biologically mine, what are my options for avoiding financial responsibility? He'd been planning his escape route before Emma had even learned to smile. I spent the rest of that week in a strange state of clarity. The hurt was still there, but it was now accompanied by something more powerful: a cold, determined anger. Will had made his choices. Now I would make mine. I called his family and invited them for Sunday dinner. Just a small gathering to celebrate Emma's baptism properly, I told his mother. Something intimate and family-focused. They came expecting pot roast and pleasant conversation. Linda brought flowers and that same patronizing smile she'd worn at the baptism. Will's parents arrived with a bottle of wine and questions about Emma's latest developmental milestones. The atmosphere was typically cordial, tinged with the familiar undercurrent of judgment I'd learned to recognize. We were halfway through dinner when Linda made her mistake. Looking at Emma in her high chair, she smiled and said, "She's getting so big. Still doesn't look like anyone from our side, though. Maybe she takes after the mailman." The table erupted in uncomfortable laughter. Will's father chuckled. His mother smiled tightly. And Will, me husband, Emma's father grinned and shook his head like he was hearing a mildly amusing observation rather than another attack on his daughter's legitimacy. I reached into my purse and pulled out the manila envelope. The laughter died instantly as I placed it on the table between the mashed potatoes and green beans. "Since you all seem so interested in Emma's genetics," I said, my voice steady and clear, "here are the official results. Feel free to discuss them openly, just like you've been discussing your doubts." The silence that followed was absolute. Will's face went white, then red, then white again. Linda's fork clattered to her plate. Emma continued eating her mashed peas, oblivious to the fact that she was at the center of a family implosion. "Naomi," Will's mother began, her voice tight with forced composure, "this is a private family matter. There's no need to." "Private?" I interrupted, surprised by the steadiness of my own voice. "You've been discussing Emma's paternity at family gatherings for months. You gave me a DNA test kit and told me to use it. You made jokes about delivery men and mailmen in front of our friends and relatives. Nothing about this has been private." Will finally found his voice. "Honey, I know how this looks, but—" "Do you?" I asked, turning to face him directly. "Do you know how it looks when a father laughs at jokes about his own daughter's legitimacy? Do you know how it feels to be treated like a liar and a cheat by the people who should trust you most?" I reached into my purse again and pulled out my phone. With steady fingers, I played a recording I'd made weeks earlier. Will's voice, clear and unmistakable, talking to his friend about his concerns. "If that baby isn't mine, I'm not getting stuck paying for someone else's mistake for 18 years. The words hung in the air like smoke. Emma banged her spoon against her tray, the only sound in the room besides the ticking of our grandfather clock. Will's family stared at him, then at me, then at the envelope that contained proof of what they'd all been questioning. "She's your granddaughter," I said to Will's parents, my voice never wavering. "She's your niece," I added, looking at Linda. "And she's your daughter," I finished, meeting Will's eyes. "The test confirms what I've known all along. The question is, what are you going to do with that information?" I moved out the next morning. Not permanently, not yet, but Emma and I went to stay with my best friend Sarah while I figured out what came next. Will called constantly, texting apologies and explanations, but I wasn't ready to hear them. I needed space to think clearly. Sarah's guest room became our temporary sanctuary. Emma adapted quickly, as babies do, but I could see the stress in her more frequent night wakings and clingy behavior during the day. She sensed the disruption even if she couldn't understand it. I found a family lawyer who specialized in cases involving trust and betrayal. Janet Morrison had kind eyes and a firm handshake, and she didn't try to talk me out of anything. "What do you want the outcome to be?" she asked during our first meeting. "I want accountability," I said. "I want him to understand that actions have consequences, and I want Emma to grow up seeing that her mother doesn't accept disrespect, even from people who claim to love her." The legal paperwork was straightforward: temporary separation, restricted access to joint accounts, and a requirement for counseling before any reconciliation could be considered. Will could see Emma, but only with supervision until he completed a program on building trust in relationships. The emotional work was harder. I had to examine my own role in allowing the disrespect to continue for so long. I had to confront the reality that I'd been more invested in keeping peace than in demanding respect. Those were painful realizations, but necessary ones. Emma and I developed new routines. Morning walks around Sarah's neighborhood, where she would point at dogs and birds and babble in her baby language. Afternoon visits to the library, where she would crawl between the children's bookshelves while I read parenting books and tried to envision our future. Evening baths in Sarah's guest bathroom, where Emma would splash and laugh like nothing in her world had changed. 3 months later, on Emma's first birthday, I allowed Will to host a party at our house. He'd completed the counseling program, attended family therapy sessions, and written letters of apology to both me and Emma, letters I'd keep for her to read when she was older. The guest list was smaller this time. Sarah came along with my parents and sister. Will's family was invited, but with clear boundaries about acceptable behavior. Linda chose not to attend, which was probably for the best. Before we cut the cake, Will asked to speak. He stood in our living room holding Emma on his hip and addressed the small gathering with words that had taken him months to find. "A year ago I became a father," he began, his voice slightly shaky. "But I spent the first months of my daughter's life questioning whether she was really mine instead of simply loving her for who she is. I let doubt poison something that should have been pure joy. I hurt my wife by failing to trust her, and I hurt my daughter by treating her like a question mark instead of a miracle." Emma reached for his nose, and he smiled despite the tears in his eyes. "Emma Grace Bennett is my daughter in every way that matters. She always has been. The only question was whether I would be worthy of being her father." I watched from across the room, holding my own emotions in check. This wasn't about forgiveness, not yet. This was about acknowledgement and the beginning of accountability. Will had a long way to go before he earned back what he'd carelessly thrown away. But as I watched Emma laugh and clap her hands at the attention, I felt something I hadn't experienced in months: a hope. Not hope that our marriage would return to what it had been, that version was gone forever. But hope that we might build something different, something stronger, something based on respect rather than assumption. Emma's first year had been marked by questions about her identity and belonging. But as she took her wobbly first steps across our living room that afternoon, reaching alternately for Will and for me, I realized something important. She belonged to herself first. Our job wasn't to prove she was ours, but to prove we were worthy of being hers. The path forward wasn't clear, and I didn't know if Will and I would ultimately stay together or forge separate but cooperative futures. What I did know was that Emma would grow up watching her mother demand respect, insist on truth, and refuse to accept less than she deserved. Those were lessons worth learning, regardless of what our family structure ultimately looked like. As the party wound down and guests began to leave, I stood in the kitchen cleaning up cake plates and thinking about second chances. Not everyone deserves them, and not everyone who receives them makes good use of the opportunity. But Emma deserved to see her parents try to build something worthy of her trust, Even if we'd started from a place of broken faith, the test results were still in my desk drawer, official proof of something that should never have needed proving. Someday, I might show them to Emma, along with the story of how her first year taught us all about the difference between biological connection and unconditional love. But for now, they served as a reminder. Truth has power, but only when we're brave enough to demand it and strong enough to act on it. I am no longer the wife who begs to be believed. I am the mother teaching her daughter that she never has to ask permission to expect respect.